Politics is designed to be exhausting, and I spent the last few months feeling hopeless as I looked at American politics, trying to understand why it feels this way. And the deeper I looked into the systems behind our politics, the more unsettling the answer became. Because what makes politics feel exhausting isn't accidental. As I researched more for this video, however, I saw another pattern emerge. Throughout American history, ordinary people like you and I have found ways to push back against a political system that feels corrupt and useless. And the most interesting thing I found is that there's actually a pattern to how they did it. So in this video, we're going to break down how the political game really works, the three forces that shape our politics, why politicians start ignoring ordinary people, and how things like gerrymandering reshape entire communities. And most importantly, how people throughout history have pushed back against these forces and what we can do about it today. And if you're new here, my name is Chris, and I'm just a regular person working a 9 to 5 just like you. After spending way too much time on social media being reminded about how hopeless the world feels, I started this channel because I think we need more hopeful and actionable content, not just another video telling us about how bad everything is. I spend a few hours every night after work making these videos because I genuinely believe people deserve to hear what they can do to make a difference in the world instead of just feeling powerless. So if you support that idea, help a small channel out by subscribing and hyping this video. It genuinely reminds me, even on my bad days, why making videos like this is still worth it. So let's get into why the system feels so exhausting in the first place. Part 1. Why should you care? Before we get any further though, I think there's a fair question that has to be asked. Why should we even care about the political system when people are struggling to get by in the first place, or when war is happening across the world? I understand why that can feel abstract, but the political system isn't separate from those issues. It's the very mechanism that determines how those issues get handled. Wars don't just happen without the leaders we elect. An economic policy that determines whether you can afford rent or healthcare doesn't just happen randomly. Underneath all of it are incentives, institutions, and structures that shape what politicians actually do. If the system rewards outrage over nuance, you get performative politicians. And if it rewards wealthy donors over voters, you get policies that reflect the wealthy's interests. And if it rewards short-term headlines instead of the long-term solutions, you get instability. So in short, if you care about human rights, economic injustice, or the cost of living, then you already care about the system. You might not just be calling it that. If you step back and look at how politics actually functions today, three forces shape almost everything that happens. Every election, every news cycle, every piece of legislation ends up being shaped by some combination of those three forces. And I'm sure you can guess what these three forces are, but I saw a pattern from these sources that emerged that will help define the so-called rules of what this game of politics is really about. A question I had honestly asked myself before researching video was this: if politics feels so frustrating, then why does it keep working this way? So the first force is no surprise, money, but money itself influences politics far more than people realize. When people think about money in politics, they usually imagine a wealthy donor or corporation handing a politician a bag of cash to pass a bill that cuts their taxes. But what's actually interesting is that most of the money in politics isn't spent on passing laws, it's actually spent on politicians getting elected in the first place. And if you've ever paid attention to the presidential elections, which I seriously hope you do, then you've probably noticed something very strange, because once the election ends, all the money that shows up in the headlines related to the campaigns just suddenly disappear. The ads stop, the spending stops, the political machinery shuts down, but during the campaign, the money determines who gets to be seen and who gets to be heard. And once you realize that, it becomes clear how politicians actually spend their time. The first rule of the political game, once I learned all this information, is this: money decides power. And there are many accounts of members of Congress openly admitting that a huge portion of their time is dedicated to just fundraising. Not legislating, not listening to real people, but just fundraising. And when you look at the incentives, it actually does make sense. Being a politician often means you're listening to actual experts explain the policies and then just deciding to whether to vote yes or no. Unfortunately, you don't have to have any formal education or qualifications to even become a politician, but before any of that of course happens, you have to first win the job. So of course the biggest priority for any politician is not so much running the government, but just winning the election itself to get the job. And as I mentioned before, elections have become incredibly expensive, which means politicians have to spend their time where their money is at. So of course it's a lot easier for them to speak to a ballroom full of wealthy donors at a fundraising event than it is to talk to working families across the country who are just trying to live their own lives and don't even probably know about who their local representatives are. But once politics starts to revolve around the wealthy donors and corporations instead of ordinary people, another rule starts to appear, which is rule number 2: actions change systems. The clearest example of this rule came after Citizens United during the 2016 presidential election. Billions of dollars flowed through super PACs and outside political groups, and what I did not know prior to researching for this project is that Hillary Clinton actually outspent Donald Trump during her own political campaign. But regardless though, Trump's campaign spent a massive amount of over $300 million, most of which came from wealthy donors, which obviously affected the entire political landscape of that election. And when you look at the list of those top donors, the incentives became very clear and obvious. Many of them were openly advocating for lower taxes, and cutting taxes is exactly what happened. Soon after taking office, Trump passed the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which lowered the federal corporate tax rate from 35% all the way down to 21% and delivered a disproportionately large benefit to the top 1% and profitable corporations. Ordinary Americans only saw marginal tax relief by saving a few $100, while the deficits only grew and the social programs that most American citizens actually use continued to dwindle. And to understand the scale of how much this personally affects us, please consider this. The United States is now spending more on interest payments for national debt than on the entire national military defense budget, and those payments are rapidly approaching the scale of major programs like healthcare. And if that does not frustrate you enough, we spend more on healthcare as a nation per person than any other country that provides universal healthcare. Even a small reduction in those interest payments could dramatically expand public services. For example, just 1% of the interest we currently pay alone could literally fund school lunches for the children across the country. But of course, it's not about the children, because when the loudest voices for politicians are clearly wealthy donors asking for tax cuts, it becomes much easier to kick those problems down the road for someone else to fight the problem when it has only gotten worse, which leads to the second rule again: actions change systems. And in fact, according to Open Secrets, the majority of political donations in 2016 came from political groups and a small number of very elite donors writing as much as 6 to 7 figure checks. So while millions of ordinary Americans vote once every 4 years, a much smaller group of wealthy donors is constantly participating in the political system. They fund the campaigns, they shape the messaging, and they build the infrastructure that keeps their interests front and center. Corporations, empowered by the Citizens United decision, didn't just sit back. Just like how we understand that our democracy is constantly unraveling as well, these corporations also too saw the opportunity where they could take a stand. So they organized, they invested, and they funneled their money strategically into candidates who would reward their investment. So while most Americans aren't paying attention to the system behind the scenes, the most powerful politicians are constantly acting inside of it, and those actions shape the rules of the game. The second force shaping politics today is attention, and the way attention works now is very different from even just 20 years ago. Political information used to flow through a few centralized institutions, so your TVs, your newspapers, and radio. But nowadays, most political information flows through online platforms, which operate under a legal framework most people have never heard of, which is Section 230. And just to briefly explain what Section 230 is, Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act says that online platforms are generally not legally responsible for content users post on their website. That's essentially how platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter end up operating. They provide the platform, but they aren't treated like the publisher. And that legal protection allows social media to grow really quickly, but it also created a new political environment where the most valuable resource is attention. Attention, of course, is also not distributed evenly, as algorithms reward content that keep people watching, reacting, and sharing. So of course, the things that spread are emotions, outrage, and conflict. Political strategists have learned how to exploit this idea. So of course, you may have heard of the phrase flood the zone, which is the simple idea that if you produce enough controversies and emotional reactions, that the public itself becomes chaotic in their conversations, so that when everything feels urgent, nothing actually gets resolved. And with all that being said, politics now exists in an algorithmically designed environment, which is done to maximize engagement and nothing else. So clarity and nuance and understanding are all dropped off on the wayside just to maximize engagement. And that's where Rule 3 comes in, which is that attention amplifies power. And the third and final force shaping politics today are organizations. And honestly, this ended up being the most important force I found while researching for how our systems actually work. So I wanted to take some time to explain how it is, because modern politics nowadays runs through two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, which at the end of the day are just really well-funded, large coordinated organizations. So if a politician wants to pass a legislation, they need the party behind them. But if they move too far outside the party line, they can get primaried. Now, going into this research, I didn't even really understand what being primaried meant, but in simple terms, it means someone from your own party runs against you to take your seat. So the challenge doesn't come from the other side, it actually comes from inside your own team. And if you've ever asked yourself why our politics ever rarely seems to change, especially when you look at the political map and you see the same patterns over and over again, the answer starts to get really interesting. But I'll come back to that later in the video. Primary challenges help explain why gridlock has become so common. The most major legislation requires 60 votes to pass. That means that compromise is necessary in order to make anything happen, but breaking from your own party carries an enormous risk. And that's where primaries end up coming in. Getting primaried can end a political career. At best, a well-intentioned politician has to carefully pick their battles, deciding when it's worth risking their seat to vote for something that might actually help the people. At worst though, a cautious or corrupt politician simply just avoids compromise entirely, continuing to enable the gridlock that we see today. And with that being said, I do want to ask you something. Have you ever felt frustrated with the two-party system? Have you ever wondered why, if so many people dislike it, why don't we have more parties representing more perspectives? The problem is connected to something even more deeper and intrinsic to our American voting system, and that's plurality. Plurality voting simply means whoever gets the most votes wins. And you might know that part, but what you might not know is that even if you don't have the majority, for as long as you have the most, you win. So political scientists call this effect the Duverger's law. So here's a simple example just to paint a picture of what that really does look like. So imagine there's three parties. There's Party A, and they have 40 votes. Party B has 39 votes, and Party C gets 21 votes. Party A wins, even though 60% of people wanted to have someone else in office. So if you see what happens over time, people start voting strategically. If you like Party C, but you know they can't win, you might as well just vote for Party B instead just to stop Party A. And when millions of voters start thinking this way, the smaller parties end up disappearing entirely, and everything consolidates into just the two big parties. And once politics becomes a two-party system like we have today, the biggest threat to a politician somehow is not losing to the other party, but losing inside to their own party. That's why primaries matter so much, and of course, too much at this point, because they force politicians to stay aligned with their party's base, even when compromise might make more sense for them and for average American citizens. And once you see this dynamic, the final rule becomes very clear. Rule number 4, organizations beat individuals. The most common phrase I hear when it comes to choosing who to vote for during the presidential elections is to vote for the lesser of the two evils. And my problem with that phrase is that most people hate the fact that it is the lesser of two evils. And the reason why is because most people think it is caused by bad politicians, but it's not. It's baked into the system itself. The two major parties have very little incentive to change plurality voting, which could be the major difference between whether or not we have two political parties versus three. The problem is that individual politicians can't change that structure on their own, even if they wanted to, because the organizations they belong to, the Democrats and the Republicans, both benefit from ultimately controlling the game between the two. And now that you take a step back at everything we talked about, a pattern really starts to emerge. Money shapes who can compete in politics, attention shapes what people actually focus on, and organization shapes what actually gets done. And from those forces, the full rules of the political game appear like we talked about. Rule number 1, money decides power. Number 2, actions change systems. Number 3, attention amplifies power. And number 4, organizations beat individuals. Once you start seeing these rules, politics stops looking a lot like random chaos, and it behaves exactly like the way incentives push it to behave. These aren't just a set of rules that I just came up with that looked right. These are legit the rules that if you look at them on your own, you realize are the exact playbook that will continue to persevere throughout all of political history. Which raises a question. If these forces are so powerful, how have ordinary people ever managed to change anything at all? Because looking back at American history, moments of real change never happened because politicians decided to change the system for a better. They decided because ordinary people learned how to push back against these forces. So throughout history, the people who actually successfully changed the system weren't always the loudest voices, they definitely weren't the richest, and they weren't the ones dominating the attention economy. They understood something simpler actually, and it is how to organize power themselves. Because the system itself is definitely exhausting, but it is not immovable. In order to fully understand how that change happened though, we do need to learn still how these rules have changed the way we vote for our politics and how it exists currently today. You've probably heard of the term gerrymandering, but at its simplest, it's when electoral districts are drawn in a way that gives one political party an advantage over the other. That's why so many legislative maps that you see often make no sense geographically. It is actually interesting to see how gerrymandering actually works through two main strategies. One strategy is packing, which is when a party squeezes as many of the opposition voters as possible into a single district. They might win in that one district, but in that one district alone. In doing so, these votes can't help elect anyone anywhere else. Those votes are effectively wasted at the end of the day, and that waste is strategic. And another strategy for gerrymandering is cracking, which is when a party spreads the opposition voters across many districts into small enough chunks that they never form a majority and win in any district. This of course dilutes their influence across the board. And the Brennan Center of Justice puts it very plainly as well. Most states have extremely uncompetitive districts because the maps have been drawn to protect the current politicians in power, the incumbents, and they preserve their advantage rather than trying to draw maps accurate and honestly to the population in the state. And the legal backdrop here matters as well. In the court case Rucho versus Common Cause in 2019, the US Supreme Court basically said that partisan gerrymandering is a political question the federal courts can't review, meaning that federal judges won't step in to fix blatantly rigged maps. And here's where people actually start to feel gerrymandering in practice. When districts are drawn to heavily favor one party, most elections don't end up being elections anymore, they become formalities. According to an analysis from the Cook Political Report, the majority of US House districts are solidly Republican or solidly remotely democratic, meaning they aren't competitive. That removes the incentive for any politician to earn votes from a broad range of people. Instead, in districts like that, the real contest, of course, isn't the general election, but what you probably guessed is the primary election, where voters vote within the single party who the nominee will be. And this is where one of the rules we really talked about earlier shows up clearly in real life, which is rule number 4, organizations beat individuals. Even if a politician personally wants to compromise or represent a broader group of voters, they're still operating inside a party organization. So if they go too far outside the organization, they risk being replaced. So instead of being accountable to a broad mix of voters, representatives in safe seats often become accountable primarily to their most active base, the people who show up to the primaries, donate money, and often threaten their incumbency. This means in practice that when people say politicians don't talk to normal people, the reason is very structural. The system doesn't require them to if their district isn't competitive. So with that being said, if the system feels unfair, you might wonder why parties don't just stop doing it. But the reason is pretty simple. If one party stops doing it and the other one continues, that party just simply loses seats. It's not about morals, it's just the incentives of the system at the end of the day. So when state legislators draw the maps in most states, and those same legislators are the one running for re-election, they have every reason to protect the power they already hold. Without a neutral referee or a unified rule set, there's no structural penalty for doing gerrymandering. There's only a structural reward. So the result is predictable. Maps often stay gerrymandered for the entire decade after each census because once the rules have been optimized to benefit the incumbents, there's no incentive to undo them unless the opposing party takes control of the legislature. And of course, they're just going to do the same thing too. So the bigger insight that we can take away about gerrymandering is the feedback loop it creates that I really don't see too many people talk about. And it basically goes like this. Politicians don't need to persuade broad groups of voters. Campaigns focus on energizing narrow bases. Appealing to the disengaged majority becomes risky. Polarization increases, and normal people start to feel ignored and disengage. And that disengagement feeds right back into the incentive structure, because low turnouts already benefit the active voters, not a casual or disengaged voter, which brings us back to another rule we talked about earlier, which is rule number 2, actions change systems. The people in the groups who consistently organize, vote, and show up are the ones who are actually shaping the system, while the people who disengage are the ones who are slowly losing the influence. If you ever wondered why there's so many old people in politics, you only have to look at who's actually voting, which is all the freaking old people. This is how the structural design actually translates directly into lived experiences. The elections themselves start to feel hollow, the political rhetoric becomes performative, and the participation starts to feel pointless. I don't want you to come out of this section feeling hopeless about gerrymandering though. In fact, this next section should help you reignite hope that there is change even when gerrymandering is so prevalent. Before we get into those examples though, I wanted to start off this section with the question that inspired this whole video in the first place, which was why are some states red and blue in the first place? Because I thought about it a bit more and I really wonder why everyone talks about these states, especially in like political spheres, as if it's all predetermined when these are real people we're talking about. The bigger question I actually ended up asking myself was this: can politics actually be about speaking to the people? The answer to that question, like with any question nowadays, is both yes and no. So let's first tackle why exactly it's no. The answer often starts with political abandonment. People usually feel ignored way long before they stop voting. So once a state or district is labeled safe, politicians on both national and local levels stop investing real attention there. Campaign visits slow down, messaging becomes generic, and leadership leans heavily on national talking points instead of addressing the specific realities people are living with, such as local economies and the education system. The problem is that these aren't just random cases of abandonment happening, it's literally rational under the current incentives of the political system. So once a district becomes safe, campaigns start allocating more resources where persuasion actually does change outcomes. The swing states, the states and the districts that actually change Democrat and Republican every election. But of course, as you can expect in this video, it creates another feedback loop. Politicians focus on places where persuasion has the highest payoff. Voters outside those places feel ignored and disengaged. Lower turnout makes those districts even safer, and safe districts reduce the incentive to persuade, and politicians double down on mostly speaking to their base anyways. So every time a community stops being visited or spoken to, its practical relevance in the campaign shrinks, and that's literally not just a theory. It's a lived reality for millions and millions of people. So what does that abandonment actually look like in real life? Well, I actually wanted to take a look at 2 examples that only explain abandonment, but also to answer the question of, can politics actually speak to real people? Because the answer is just as much yes as it is no. So let's start off in the state of Pennsylvania with a person named Rick, someone from a working class town. For generations, Rick's family voted Democrat, and it's not particularly unusual. Communities were built around, in this district at least, manufacturing jobs, steel mills, unions, and the promise of generational stability. Pennsylvania was actually part part of what people call the Blue Wall, which is a group of states Democrats assumed they could rely on because the party historically represented the labor and the working class interests. Then deindustrialization hit, so factories closed, jobs disappeared, and wages stalled, and young people left. So instead of responding directly to those material changes, Democrats, broadly speaking at least, shifted away from the working class message and focused more on cultural trends instead. And this of course created a gap. Republicans saw that gap and invested. And don't mind the light turning on, by the way. They didn't just run on slogans like Make America Great Again, they actually ran on boots on the ground campaigns. So they opened up offices, they ran ads, and they talked directly to the communities who experienced this economic insecurity, which for the most part was tied to globalization and trade deals as jobs started being outsourced to different countries. In 2016 though, Donald Trump won Pennsylvania, which was the first ever Republican to win the state in the presidential election since 1988, a literal example of a generational shift. And he did it of course by flipping the working class counties that had voted Democratic for decades. And this is once again where rule 2 comes to come in. Action changes systems. Republicans didn't just win those counties by accident, they invested resources, they organized messaging, and they spoke directly to the communities that felt abandoned. And let's be honest too about what that meant for someone like Rick. Rick didn't suddenly just wake up one day as a committed Republican. He woke up to the fact that one party slowly stopped talking to him and another one started doing so, even if it was imperfect. And it's fair to address the Republican elephant in the room, and it is that the rhetoric that does resonate with most Republicans nowadays is absolutely based on blaming immigrants and minorities for economic struggles. Not only is that rhetoric damaging, but it also shifts the discussion away from the honest conversations and more towards the division we see today. It's very cruel, and the fact that our world has even come to this point shows not that people are terrible, but that our economic and material conditions have gotten so bad that we cling on to these very stupid beliefs. If we're going to look at politics from the lens of incentives, which is what we have to do if we achieve any real change, it's clear that Republicans knew it'd be worth spending time and resources into Pennsylvania, because the underlying reason that it was reached to people in the first place felt like no one had been willing to talk to them for decades, and that was actually what was happening in their lives. The same can be said, in order to have some nuance of course, about what Democrats did to invest into the suburbs of Atlanta. As Republicans started to focus less on middle class families and their struggles, which often include healthcare costs, home ownership, and the education system, Democrats stepped in and took over. So for someone like Dan, who is a middle class voter living in the Atlanta suburbs, especially mixing into the time where more younger people were moving into Atlanta and the demographics just shifted, Democrats themselves became more diverse and investing more of their resources into these places. Just like Republicans, they ran offices, they ran year-round engagement campaigns, they focused on messaging on schools, healthcare, and everyday economic concerns, and they invested heavily into voter registration and turnout infrastructure, and the results were very dramatic. In 2018, suburban voters helped Democrats win key races, and in 2020, Georgia voted for a Democratic presidential candidate for the first time in decades. And in 2021, Georgia elected 2 Democratic senators in a high turnout runoff election, largely driven by the suburban turnout, which is Rule 4 again in practice. Organizations beat individuals. The shift itself didn't happen because a single politician gave a rousing speech. It happened because sustained organizing changed participation. So for someone like Dan, this wasn't necessarily about ideological concern. It was about finally feeling like someone was paying attention to the issues that shaped their daily life. And again, we should be honest, these communities didn't just get perfect outcomes because they voted for the right party. People still worry about taxes, infrastructure, education, and healthcare just like everywhere else because these politicians ultimately are incentivized to do nothing. There's a big difference though with being ignored and being engaged. So I wanted to dive into the idea of what these stories actually tell us. The point is that they voted for the party that showed up, the party that acknowledged their lived experiences, spoke to their material concerns, and built a communication channel with them. And that pattern broke abandonment in what was otherwise a very safe district. And most political discussions focus on ideology and morals, like left versus right, conservative versus liberal, which the main meat and bones of this is saying that when someone acknowledges someone's lived experiences, addresses their material concerns, and builds the communication channel, like I said, it's the very difference in making sure that people don't feel written off, but instead feeling represented. It shows us, especially in Pennsylvania and Atlanta, for example, that communities once taken for granted can be re-engaged. Persuasion grounded in real life actually works, and abandonment is not just a destiny, it's literally a campaign choice. And so up until this point, we've talked about safe districts, abandoned communities, and how politics stops being about persuasion, but being about protecting the incumbents. And yeah, it gets very easy to get discouraged, and you start to wonder if any of this starts to actually feel changeable, or if the system just feels too deep and too entrenched into these old habits. The exciting thing, however, and what I feel most passionate about, is that this hasn't always been this way. Every major expansion of democratic power in the United States once looked radical, even impossible, until ordinary people went way beyond just voting. They organized, they protested, and they showed up in ways that made the system pay attention. And that's exactly what we're going to look at here with the civil rights movement, because it's very important to understand the liberties that we take for granted today were the ones that were fought for, and what I would argue were conditions even worse than the ones we see today. There's a lot we can learn from this historic movement, and how we can inevitably learn from the lessons to apply them to today. In the 50s and 60s, Black Americans in the South were literally excluded from the most basic mechanisms of representation. We're not talking about minor barriers that inconvenience Black people over white people. It was literally disenfranchisement by design. Literacy tests were graded unfairly, and poll taxes were implemented just so that poor Black families couldn't pay, and there were intimidation and threats and violence at the polls. You couldn't fix this by simply just going to the ballot box. The system itself was actively shutting people out, and the opposition itself wasn't some vague force. It had names. And one of the most outspoken opponents was Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. And in fact, Senator Strom Thurmond isn't just some fringe extremist. He was actually a powerful mainstream politician who used the rules of the system to block democratic reform. He had a lot of people behind his back, and he often looks like those politicians that we see nowadays. The hundreds of politicians that we see in the House, for example, that we never know the names of, but they're the ones who are silently running things and staying complacent to all the change that happens. For Thurmond, he was famously the one that gave the filibuster against the Civil Rights Act that lasted more than 24 hours, which is one of the longest solo speeches in Senator history, all to stop Black Americans from gaining equal rights. Which is crazy to say, but this is the world that we lived in not even a few decades ago. Strom Thurmond was the one who signed the Southern Manifesto, which urged states to resist desegregation after Brown versus Board. And he also openly defended segregation when and if possible, claiming federal law couldn't enforce the South to change even with the bayonets of the army. And let's take a step back and also realize that every major, powerful, progressive movement in history that, gave regular human beings equal rights always started off from the opposition by saying that this is not a federal concern, it's a state's one. If this is something that sounds very familiar to the issues of today, and I'm not going to name any specific ones, then you should be reminded that this is one of many red flags to show which side of history is actually the one that you're on. But all this is to say is that it proves that the system protects the status quo. There's powerful politicians that can use procedure, institutions, and party loyalty to stall change for years. But like the change came anyway. And it didn't happen because politicians suddenly had a change of heart. It happened because people organized. Groups like the NAACP fought discriminatory laws in court, and the landmark Brown versus Board Act decision in 1954 ruled segregation unconstitutional and proved the legal system could actually challenge entrenched inequality. But court rulings, of course, weren't enough. The system itself, even with that ruling in mind, was still designed to block Black voters, and it definitely did. So the real change that could only happen was when people made politicians feel like ignoring them was politically impossible. So what they did was that they showed up in marches, voter registration drives, mass protests, all while it felt so incredibly unsafe to do so, when it's honestly better to just stay at home and accept your place in society. But that's not what they did. The turning point actually came during Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965. It wasn't just a symbolic protest, it was a very strategic pressure. When peaceful demonstrators were beaten on national television, when children were literally attacked with fire hoses, when that violence was broadcasted into American living rooms on TV, the political cost of ignoring the movement became way too high. And because of that pressure, the two most transformative laws in recent history have passed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination in public places, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which protected voting access across the South. Strom Thurmond didn't suddenly become convinced that segregation was suddenly a bad idea. He was the one that still opposed for these reforms for years. He filibustered, he invoked states' rights, he fought them at every step of the way. But eventually, to go back to the movement, the pressure became way too great for the system to ignore. And that's what sustained engagement actually does. It brings us back again to the rules, which is that Rule 2 says, actions change systems. And now this is just a side tangent I wanted to put in the video as well, but I originally was also going to discuss the women's suffrage movement, but ultimately I was just going to make the same point I did anyways with the Civil Rights Act. But I always feel like if I knew that my audience was interested in this kind of stuff and really wanted to just dive deep more into the historical context and who the villains were in the story, then please do let me know down in the comments. Your support does mean everything, and while I try to make some time, the few hours I have every day after work to make YouTube a dream happen, I hope that you can lend your support by leaving a nice comment down below and just lending me some of your incredible and most intriguing thoughts. So what do the stories of Georgia, Pennsylvania, and the Civil Rights Movement tell us? It's very simple. People don't get what they want, and they especially don't get it right away under the current political system. That's just not how it works, and unfortunately that may not always work out like that. But the turning point came a lot simpler when it came to creating real change. People showed up, and politicians couldn't ignore it. This is quite literally the most important feedback loop out of this whole video that should bring you the most hope. So now that we discussed everything that we have in this video about what sustained organized pressure looks like and how we got to this point, the natural question then becomes, what can we actually do today? Unlike the villains of the past, the levers we need for change are already in our hands, and it's very simple as we discussed. It's participation, organization, and pressure work. Right now, politicians ignore safe districts and majority of the American population because those districts rarely ever decide elections. But with your participation, it changes that. When more people in these safe districts vote, volunteer, donate, organize, and demand attention, something important happens. Safe districts become competitive. And when districts become competitive, politicians suddenly have to care. Especially as recently as 2026, states like Texas and Ohio swapped from red to blue because of the fact that politicians stepped in and spoke to real material concerns. So the local potholes that you see, and how messed up your school is, or the infrastructure, or whatever it is in your local town, like the role of AI and data centers taking up your energy bills, these things that people actually live with every day can actually be addressed when we start participating in general more. Politicians respond to incentives, and the incentives change when voters change them. So of course, like I said many times before, actions change systems. The good news I can tell you is this, and that there is already so many ways that we can improve the structural incentives in politics. Ranked choice voting, for example, allows voters to rank candidates instead of choosing one. This reduces polarization, and it gives candidates with a broad appeal a real chance to win without forcing voters into a strict two-party choice. Maine has already implemented ranked choice voter in the federal and state elections. The main solution for gerrymandering is already quite simple and easy: independent redistricting commissions. When you have a neutral referee that draws the maps instead of the ones who actually are benefiting from that, states like Arizona and California, example, have already followed suit so that we can have more competitive representation. If you're frustrated about how there's so much money flowing in politics that our dollars drown itself out, campaign finance reform can shift the power away from large donors by expanding public financing and specifically small dollar matching donations. This reduces the pressure for politicians to prioritize wealthy donors when they can focus on ordinary voters, knowing that their dollars literally double because our politics incentivizes that. And the reason why I emphasize voter registration, even though I haven't really discussed it before, was because even in a high stakes election like 2020 between Biden and Trump, which followed COVID-19 by the way, only 60% of people turned out. And studies show that a lot of this turnout is not a result of apathy like people might think, but because of the systemic frictions that exist that make registration so difficult. By implementing these registration and making it more accessible, it would allow more people to actually participate in our politics, and for the public, the working class itself, to be more well heard. And we're already seeing these modern examples of these positive changes coming into play as this new trend of politicians pop up. Zohran Mamdani is the most prolific figure, if you haven't heard of him, who he ran for as mayor of New York, and he went to basically challenge many establishment politicians, many who actually dismissed him, and he actually ran on policies and platforms based on universal childcare, fast and free buses, and a more affordable city. He represented real and tangible change, and he actually won. A campaign built off of an actual positive vision for New York, instead of one that just focused on keeping the machine running the way it currently is. A campaign that centers so heavily on him actually talking to real people at New York and dressing them in his speeches instead of just talking so blatantly to a crowd of people that he already represented. But that victory didn't happen because politicians gave a good speech. It happened because people organized around him. Volunteers canvassed neighborhoods and small donors funded the campaign. Voters showed up every step of the way, and especially across the country and even outside the country. His campaign spread so online, so virally, that it reached people in so many different countries, and people are saying that this is my mayor, and they're a whole sea apart from us. It's crazy to see these comments and this wave of support for someone who's literally just mayor of, granted, the biggest city in the world, but still just a city. And what it proves is something that we've already seen across history. Candidates with bold ideas can win when people actively organize behind them. And that's rule number 4 in action again. Organizations beat individuals. No politician ever and has ever will win alone. They win when people build a movement around them. And if we ever want politicians with real courage and real spines to stand up to injustices, like Democrats standing against billionaire influences or Republicans resisting authoritarian pressure, the public has to create an environment where that courage is actually rewarded. This matters right now because all the problems we see today with wealth inequality, the redacted Epstein files, and the immigration crackdowns from ICE, which is all, at the end of the day, a system symptom of a deeper issue. The politicians are responding to the wrong incentives. Gerrymandering, primary elections, and safe districts are all stuff that don't sound exciting, but those boring mechanics determine almost everything. They determine who gets heard, whose problems get attention, and whether policy serves the public or the powerful. The solutions already exist too. Ranked choice voting, fair district maps, campaign finance reform, and expanded voter access, and above all, sustained civic pressure. For as long as we keep putting on the pressure, politicians will follow suit with the demands that we put out for them. We don't have to put out a kind of pressure that has never been seen before in history. We just have to put on the same kind of pressure that exists way before the age of the internet, way before it was easy to send a text to someone across the world. This is the same kind of pressure that defeated Strom Thurmond's obstruction when it came to the civil rights. The same kind of pressure that forced the passage of the 19th Amendment with the women's suffrage movement. The same kind of pressure that granted the liberties of everyone you literally know today. Nothing about our political system is inevitable at the end of the day. As you saw in this whole video, elections can be influenced, turnout can change outcomes, and media attention can shift the narrative, and ultimately political incentives can be reshaped because politicians respond to incentives. So let's go ahead and revisit the rules of the game and now look at them with a different lens of how we as American citizens can actually benefit and use them for our own strength. Money decides power. Politicians respond to incentives, so one of the most powerful incentives in politics is funding. If campaigns cost money and organizing costs money and outreach costs money, then we should pay our part in actually donating to these causes. Organizations that actually fight for us don't just write checks off to lobbyists to run the government for us. They build the infrastructures and they hire the organizers and they coordinate the volunteers and they run the phone banks and they ran canvassing operations and they run digital campaigns that reach thousands of people. All of that work plus so much more with all the research can't be done without the support of ordinary people. It requires resources. But when thousands of ordinary people contribute even just small amounts together to these organizations, those contributions stop looking small. They become organized pressure. Demand Progress, for example, helps fund lobbying efforts with research and public pressure and campaigns that push lawmakers on issues regarding digital rights and government accountability. Open Secrets, like I cited before, tracks the flow of money in politics. It shows where the influence is coming from and helping the public understand where the leverage is actually existing. RepresentUs is another organization that actually puts volunteers and campaigns together to fight corruption and gerrymandering and all the structural incentives that we talked about in this video regarding the nitty-gritty boring politics. The point isn't just donating to these organizations and politicians that you also support, it's understanding that when ordinary people coordinate resources, they can build systems that operate every day, not just during elections, but outside of them. Understanding that your constant participation, your constant $1 a month will go much further than $25 to put in one time for one election for the next 4 years. And by the way, all the organizations that I have talked about in this video and will be talking about in this video are all going to be linked down in the description for you to look into so you can support them based on what you're comfortable with doing so. Rule number 2 is action changes systems, because obviously talking about problems doesn't change the systems, actions do. So what do those actions look like? It consists of constantly joining protests to show your support for a cause or against one. It includes phone calls, letters, and emails to your local senators and governors to let them know about how you truly feel about your politics and what's going on in our world. Town halls and community organizing allow you to actually visit those institutions and see firsthand the politicians, but also your fellow community members, and see how working together can actually make things a lot easier for you to feel like you're making a difference. Organizations like the League of Women Voters, for example, help find ways to participate locally, from voter registration to civic education and local advocacy. Groups like Indivisible and Public Citizens make coordinated activism easier to sustain by actually helping you connect you to like-minded people who just want to see what making a tangible difference looks like in their day-to-day life. All the while actually showing our politicians that our voices do matter through like email templates and other forms that you can submit to show to these politicians that a lot of people feel the same way about what's going on. Another resource I really wanted to shout out is called Run for Something, which is a great way for anyone, no matter your background in politics, to dip your toes into seeing how you can run for office and actually make changes in your localities. Do not underestimate your own experience, because if you have a vision and an ambition to strengthen your community, that should in fact encourage you to realize that you might have what it takes to be the one that makes a difference in your life, in your community. Even being a part of local community groups, neighborhood organizations, school boards, grassroots campaigns, you name it, just by being a part of your city and feeling more prideful of where you are and where you're living, does it make you more likely to be more involved and to rally more people behind you to make these actions possible. Rule number 3, attention amplifies power. This is one that I haven't talked about since the beginning of this video, but it is honestly the most relevant and easiest to employ. And that is because in politics, attention is currency. And what gets amplified is what politicians respond to. And today, one of the most powerful tools ordinary people have is the ability to amplify information. Posting or reposting social media posts that highlight the truth amidst the age where misinformation is so prevalent is so important nowadays. Supporting candidates who are actually young enough to use social media and use it to broadcast real platforms you can stand by. Again, Mom Donnie's an example of this and how successful you can run a campaign off of social media pretty much alone. At the end of the day, the establishment and what politics as it was before and the people still representing it will make you believe that you're powerless and that things should just keep running the way they are. But we have the power to amplify the truth, that we all do have a say in what matters. I think what people don't talk about enough is that if we reward more strong and honest messaging, especially with politicians, the more of these politicians will appear. The more honest and good, well-intentioned ones will actually have the courage to do so. The same feedback loop that creates division is the same kind of mechanism we can use to positively encourage more people to create the politicians that get more people excited about what politicians can do. Rule number 4 is organizations beat individuals. And of course, this is one that I cited throughout the entirety of this video, and for good reason, and it's because it is the most important one. I've already mentioned this before, but organizations like Indivisible and Public Citizens are the best way to get locally connected to the people around you to make a difference. To harken back to the two-party system, because again, I'm pretty sure people like you and me, if you made it this far, you hate it. So if you want to have another party actually win, how do you do so? Do you remember how ranked choice voting was implemented in Maine when I talked about it earlier? When you think about how it actually happened, it's so simple. A group called Vervote launched a campaign to implement ranked choice voting in Maine, and they spoke directly to voters instead of the politicians who would create these referendums. In 2016, ranked choice voting was not approved by politicians, but by citizens initiating what is called a citizens referendum, not once, but actually twice, because politicians blocked it the first time. Citizens have the power to literally implement the rules in place if we know how to do so. So if you want to learn more about the nitty-gritty details of how we can make these changes happen, please do send your support my way and let me know if you want to see more content like this. But all in short, I'll say this: when you're part of a network, you're no longer acting alone. You are part of something bigger. Once people realize they are not the only ones who care, something powerful happens. The momentum builds. One person becomes 10, 10 becomes 100, and that's when the system really starts to feel the pressure. When you really take a step back and look at everything we talked about, the pattern is so clear. Money decides power. It goes both ways. Attention shapes what gets discussed, both with politicians and with citizens. Action is what ultimately changes systems, and organizations beat individuals every time. They aren't abstract ideas. They're the same dynamics that drove the civil rights movement, that helped women with the right to vote, and the same dynamics that will shape the politics of today. Safe districts can be competitive, politicians can be pressured, and systems that once seemed immovable can change, but only when people decide to participate. And that's when the government begins to function closer to what it was supposed to be. Ranked choice voting, independent redistricting, campaign finance reform, open primaries, these solutions already exist. Figuring them out is not the hard part. The hard part is the reality that we need ordinary people to push for them. Supporting candidates with integrity, organizing in your community, and showing up consistently. That's how the rules of the game will change.